My name is Esther. Well, that is the name I am called now. My Hebrew name was Hadassah. My story is exciting and romantic, but it is also a story of assassination plots and the deepest convictions. My story started very bleakly. It all took place when my people were in exile. In my account, you will not find the promised land, because I was taken away to another man's land. This is why I changed my name from Hadassah to Esther. We had no home. What would you do if you had no place to call home? How would you feel? My story then gets worse. I had lost both of my parents. However, I found some hope. I was brought under the care of Mordecai, who lived at Susa. Mordecai was my much older cousin, so he had a lot of experience. He was also a man of God that respected the things of God. Like me, Mordecai was also in exile. Mordecai had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Mordecai took care of me like a father. Everything changed with a feast, a lavish feast inside King Xerxes' palace. King Xerxes reigned from India to Ethiopia, and in the 3rd year of his reign, he held a banquet for all his officials and his attendants. The army officers of Persia and Media, the nobles and the officials of the provinces were all there. For a complete 180 days, he displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and glory of his majesty. When these days were over, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days in the enclosed garden of the king's palace. There were couches of gold and silver on a marble pavement. It was a grand affair. The king instructed all the wine stewards to serve each man whatever he wished. The queen also gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of King Xerxes. Her name was Vashti. On a particular day, when King Xerxes was in high spirits from wine, he commanded his servants to bring Queen Vashti, wearing her royal crown, to display her beauty to the people and nobles, for she was stunning to look at. However, Queen Vashti refused to come when the attendants delivered the king's command. Then the king became furious and burned with anger. After consulting with his wise advisors, the king was informed that the actions of Vashti would set a poor example for the ladies living throughout the realm. Then one of the wise men replied in the presence of the king and the nobles, "Queen Vashti has done wrong, not only against the king, but also against all the nobles and the peoples of all the provinces of King Xerxes. Therefore, if it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree, and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, which cannot be repealed, that Vashti is never again to enter the presence of King Xerxes. Also, let the king give her royal position to someone else who is better than she." The king acted quickly. Then the king's personal attendants proposed, "Let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Let them be placed under the care of Haggai, the king's eunuch, and let beauty treatments be given to them. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This advice appealed to the king, and he followed it. When the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many young women were brought to the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Haggai. I was among those taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Haggai. But how was I to be queen when there were so many beautiful women? I did my best to please the eunuch Haggai, and he took a liking to me and showed me favor. Immediately, he provided me with beauty treatments and special food. He assigned to me 7 female attendants selected from the king's palace, and moved me and my attendants into the best place in the harem. I had not revealed my nationality and family background, because Mordecai had prohibited me from doing so. To be the queen, I would need the favor of the king. I already had the favor of Haggai and Mordecai. Mordecai always cared about me. Every day, Mordecai walked back and forth near the harem's courtyard to find out how I was doing and what was happening to me. He indeed was my guardian. But there were rules to be followed. Before a young woman's turn came to go to King Xerxes, she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatments prescribed for the women, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 with perfumes and cosmetics. And this is how she would go to the king. Anything she wanted was given to her to take from the harem to the king's palace. She would not return to the king unless he was pleased with her and summoned her by name. When my turn came to go to the king, I asked for nothing other than what Haggai suggested. I was taken to King Xerxes, and the king seemed to be attracted to me more than to any other women, and I won his favor and approval more than any of the other girls. So he set a royal crown on my head and made me queen instead of Vashti. The king gave a great banquet, my banquet. He invited all his nobles. He even proclaimed a holiday throughout the provinces and distributed gifts with royal liberality. All was going so well until I discovered the sinister truth about a vile man called Haman. He hated my people so much and sought to wipe us off the face of the earth. King Xerxes had honored Haman, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor higher than all the other nobles. All the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and honored Haman, but my cousin Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. The royal officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's command?" Day after day they spoke to him, but he refused to comply. That was Mordecai. They told Haman about all this to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated. Unlike me, they knew that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman sought a way to destroy all of Mordecai's people. Mordecai refused to bow to a mere man. The fear of God overcame any fear of man. The law of Moses did not forbid showing due respect to those in authority, but it did forbid the worship of any but God. Eastern monarchs often demanded such worship. Mordecai's fellow workers sought to gain favor in Haman's eyes by pointing out his refusal. Haman was a very egotistical man, and the sight of Mordecai's blatant disrespect infuriated him beyond reason. Instead of dealing with Mordecai alone, he set in motion a plan to annihilate all the Jews in the kingdom. Haman's first step was to cast lots to determine a suitable date for the mass execution. By a seeming coincidence, the date indicated was nearly a year away, and the lot fell on the 12th month. Then Haman said to King Xerxes. Haman next approached the king with an inflammatory report about Mordecai's people, misrepresenting them as dangerous to the kingdom. He urged that a decree be issued ordering their extinction. So the king took his signet ring from his finger and gave it to Haman. The king told Haman, "Do with the people as you please." According to the law of the Medes and Persians, once issued, this decree could never be changed or withdrawn. King Xerxes sealed the death writ with his signet ring, sentencing thousands of innocent men, women, and children to be sacrificed at the altar of Haman's pride. Copies of the execution order were sent out with great thoroughness, setting the 13th day of the 12th month aside for the atrocity. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality, so they would be ready for that day. The king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was bewildered. My people were stunned as the news broke throughout the land. There is always sadness where evil reigns. Mordecai put on mourner's garb and lamented through the city until he came to the king's gate, beyond which he could not go, because sackcloth was not allowed in his majesty's presence. He knew that he was the main object of Haman's hatred. In every province to which the edict and order of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. When my eunuchs and male attendants came and told her about Mordecai, I was in great distress. I summoned Hathach, one of my servants, and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city, in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him the whole story. He also gave him a copy of the text of Haman's edict, which had been published in Susa, to show and explain it to me. He instructed me to go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Since custom forbade me to leave my confinement in the palace, I sent a servant to take some garments to clothe Mordecai, so the king might not see him in sackcloth. If that happened, he could lose his life. But Mordecai refused to disguise his despair. I responded to Mordecai by reminding him that it was a capital offense to appear before the king uninvited, unless he spared the intruder's life by extending the golden scepter. When my message was passed along to Mordecai, he returned this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. If you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for our people will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? Mordecai's reply was to the point. If I refused to act now, someone else would arise to deliver the people of God, and perhaps this opportunity to save my people was why I had been exalted to the throne. Each individual has an essential role to play in the ongoing plan of God. Perhaps this is my role. I told them to tell Mordecai, go gather all the Jews that are present in Susa and observe a fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I also will fast in the same way. Then I will go in to see the king, without being summoned, which is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. The line was cast. I just made a decision that may cost me my life, and I am at peace with this. So Mordecai went away and did exactly as I had commanded him. Although my danger be significant, considering the law and the severity which he showed to my predecessor Vashti, I will go to the king and cast myself cheerfully upon God, rather than neglect my duty to God and his people for my safety and success. On the 3rd day, when the fast was completed, I put on her royal robes, summoned courage, and appeared before the king uninvited. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall, facing the entrance. When he saw me standing in the court, what do you think he did? Well, he was pleased with me and held out to her the gold scepter in his hand. So I approached and touched the tip of the scepter. Then the king asked, What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom it will be given you. This was the moment. The next words I speak would determine the fate of an entire group of people. If it pleases the king, I replied, let the king, together with Haman, come today to a banquet I have prepared for him. Then the king said, Bring Haman quickly so that we may do as Esther says. So the king and Haman came to the banquet that I had prepared. I do this work covertly, so that Haman is not even aware of my plans. As Haman and the king drank their wine at the banquet, the king said to me, What is your petition? It shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Even to half of the kingdom it shall be done. Then I replied, My petition and my request is this. If I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and to do as I request, May the king and Haman come to the banquet that I will prepare for them. And tomorrow I will do as the king says and express my request." Haman went away that day joyful and in good spirits. He must have felt so special. The queen had invited him to a private event with the king. He just dined with the most important man and woman in the land, and tomorrow he had been invited by the queen together with the king. What could spoil his great mood? Well, I will tell you. It was Mordecai. Naaman saw Mordecai at the king's gate, and Mordecai refused to stand up or even show fear before him. Haman controlled himself and went home. Everything was going better than I could have planned myself. That night, the king could not sleep, so he ordered that the book of records and memorable deeds be brought, and they were read before the king. He found out how my cousin Mordecai had reported that 2 of the king's eunuchs, who were doorkeepers, had planned to attack the king. The king asked, "What honor has been given Mordecai for this?" Then the king's servants who attended him said, "Nothing has been done for him." So the king said, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace and came in. The king said, "What is to be done for the man whom the king desires to honor?" Haman definitely did not think the king was referring to Mordecai. Haman said, "For the man whom the king desires to honor, let a royal robe be brought, which the king has worn, and the horse on which the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown has been placed. And let the robe and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. Let him dress the man whom the king delights to honor in the royal robe, and lead him on horseback through the open square of the city, and proclaim before him, 'This is what shall be done for the man whom the king desires to honor.'" Following this, the king ordered Haman to move quickly and bestow all of these accolades, not on Haman, but on Mordecai. Then the king said, "Quickly take the royal robe and the horse, as you have said, and do this for Mordecai, who is sitting at the king's gate. Leave out nothing of all that you have said." This must have shocked Haman. He just set my uncle up for great success. Now Mordecai was one of the most influential men in the land. So Haman took the royal robe and the horse and dressed Mordecai, and led him on horseback through the open square of the city, proclaiming before him, "This is what shall be done for the man whom the king desires to honor." Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate. But Haman hurried to his own house, mourning and with his head covered in sorrow. He just made Mordecai a man of more excellent status. He had no authority to shove Mordecai around now. After this, the king's attendants arrived and hurriedly brought Haman to the banquet that I had prepared. This was not the best day for Haman. So the king and Haman came to my banquet, and as they were drinking wine on the second day, the king asked again. He said, "Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom it will be granted." Then I answered, "If I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king." King Xerxes asked me, "Who is he? Where is he? The man who has dared to do such a thing?" I said, "An adversary and enemy. This vile Haman." Look at his face. He was terrified. The king got up in a rage, left his wine, and went out into the palace garden. But Haman stayed behind to beg me for his life. This might have been his biggest mistake. The king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall. Haman fell on the couch where I was reclining. The king exclaimed, "Will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house?" As soon as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Then one of the eunuchs attending the king said, "A pole reaching to a height of 50 cubits stands by Haman's house. He had set it up for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king." Can you imagine that? He was working on a plan to get rid of my cousin. I did not have to say anything, however. The king said, "Impale him on it." So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. The king removed his signet ring, which he had taken away from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And I put Mordecai in charge of the house of Haman. This was better than a person could orchestrate. Haman was no longer present, but his heinous plot remained. Then I spoke again to the king and fell down at his feet and wept and implored him to avert the evil plot of Haman and his plan which he had devised against the Jews, because the decree to annihilate the Jews was still in effect. Then the king held out the golden scepter to me, so I arose and stood before the king. Then I said, "If it pleases the king, and if I have found favor before him, and the matter is proper in the king's view, and I am pleasing in his sight, let it be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, which he wrote in order to destroy the Jews who are in all the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see the tragedy that will happen to my people? Or how can I endure to see the destruction of my kindred?" The king permitted Mordecai and me to write another decree counteracting the first one. The king's scribes were called, and Mordecai dictated an edict that gave the Jews the right to protect their lives. With great speed, the new law was carried to the utmost parts of the kingdom on swift royal steeds. How much more should the news of man's redemption from the power of evil be disseminated through Satan's realm with thoroughness and speed? Having discarded his sackcloth, Mordecai left the palace in robes of splendor. My people were glad when they heard of the sudden events, while the rest were filled with dread. Not wanting to be numbered among their enemies, many Gentiles became converts at this time. In each province and city, whether the king's command and his decree arrived, the Jews celebrated with gladness and joy a feast and a holiday. Even the princes and rulers aided my people because they feared Mordecai, the kingdom's second most powerful man. Mordecai was a true patriot, and when he was elevated to the highest position under the king, he used his work to help his people. I was far from home, but God placed me in a position of power in a pagan society. Thankfully, I did not compromise my principles. We made significant headway in advancing our faith. My royal position was for that reason. I was called for a time like this. I didn't belong in the pagan world. There was a risk for me to conform to everyone. However, I was prepared to give my life. My name is Esther, and this is my story.